back into our time in the intertestamental period. Remember last time we were together, we had just finished talking a little bit about John Hyrcanus. And as it related to John Hyrcanus, recall that as he was appointed, we are still in the time technically of Israel's autonomy, but because of the nature of the deals that had been made with Rome, that time will quickly be coming to an end. Recall John Hyrcanus is the man who went into the Samaritans and destroyed their temple, and forced the Idumeans to be circumcised and to follow and submit themselves to the law of Moses. So John Hyrcanus was a very zealous nationalist, and sought to, I guess you could say, subjugate some of those other people who were around them. Now do take note, remember that Hyrcanus was also the man that dismantled the Pharisees. And we find that he chased them into hiding. He abolished the Pharisaic law. So we find within this time between Hyrcanus and Alexandra that this 30, 50 some odd years is a time where the Sadducees again had some measure of freedom of prominence. Hyrcanus was not a Hellenist. At this point, the idea of Syria taking over, or the idea of Syria being the Greek religion taking over, was not even on the table anymore. So this really didn't have anything to do with Hellenizing, though Hyrcanus was very friendly with the Syrians at this time. However, it was very much so, he wanted to remove this far-right sect, as it were, of the Pharisees, and he did so, and the Pharisees ended up kind of going into hiding in this time. Hyrcanus would rule for 31 years in the Hasmonean dynasty from 135 to 105 BC, which brings us to Aristobulus. After Hyrcanus died, Aristobulus took over 105 to 104 BC. He was assassinated, and depending on the history that you look at, it's possible that he was assassinated with the help of his wife, who was named Alexandra. Alexandra would become the high priest, the ruler here in just a little bit. After Aristobulus dies, Alexander Jannaeus takes over, and he ends up marrying Alexandra, which is probably perhaps why, if at the very least rumors were going around that she had something to do with his death, it would be in the fact that she ended up marrying the man who took his place. And during this time, he was still very harsh to the Pharisees, but Alexandra was not. Alexandra was known to help the Pharisees, to hide the Pharisees from the law. She was an advocate for the Pharisees, and she sought to make her husband so. He was unwilling to do so. According to Josephus, tradition tells us that on his deathbed, instead of passing along his authority to one of his sons, who we'll talk about in a minute, he passed the authority along to Alexandra with the explicit request that she reestablish the Pharisees, that she allow them to come back into society. And indeed, when he dies, she does take power, and she does exactly that. She reestablishes the power of the Pharisees, she reestablishes the power of the Sanhedrin, and the Pharisees from this point on, we are now in that 70 BC range. From this point to 70 AD, so that 140-year stretch, 150-year stretch, the Pharisees would not again lose their influence in the nation. Now, Alexandra is only the second leader in Judah or Jerusalem's history. The first being Athaliah in the Old Testament, if you recall, there in the Kings and the Chronicles, and then she being the second. Of course, these were not called kings and queens. It was the high priest, and so in a manner of speaking, she was considered to be the high priest, the female high priest. I don't know how many people called her the high priest. I don't know how many people would have been up for that. There's certainly no precedent in the Old Testament law for a woman to be made a high priest or a priest in any capacity. But what is so interesting about this is that from Hyrcanus to Alexandra, the 50 years between there, it took a woman high priest to reestablish this very legal sect, the Pharisees, who no doubt would have been very appalled, right, by her being the high priest. Very strange thing. The group, I can't imagine they would not have been appalled at her being the high priest, and yet she's the one that reestablished their authority and their power. The Pharisaic hold on power would not again be lost until Israel is destroyed in 70 AD. And the Pharisaic law was reestablished and renewed and given extra authority. So now we see the final kick of authority given by Alexandra to the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin that would carry them into this final phase before the New Testament picks back up. We're about 70 years out now from the New Testament. We then go to Aristobulus II. He ruled from 69 to 63 BC, so only 6 years there. Alexander dies, and Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, these are the two sons of Alexander Jannaeus. And so they begin to fight over who would become the next high priest. Hyrcanus II had the legal right. He was the one who legally had the right to take that position. But Aristobulus was significantly more assertive. Hyrcanus was a fairly weak ruler. He had very little motivation. He had very little character. And so Aristobulus very quickly and easily claims that victory and overthrows Hyrcanus' rule, and he rules for a number of years. So we have this thing happening in Israel between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, and it's all very pagan, right? This whole thing is very, very pagan, assassinations and fighting over who's going to rule, and it's very pagan, it's very political, in a sense, it probably dramatically reduced Israel's credibility in relation to anything that they would have wanted to reflect as it relates to God's people, right? They're no different than anyone else. They've got the assassinations, they've got the political deposing of one guy for another guy, they've got the jockeying back and forth for power and for influence, and so very little by way of any sort of a distinction that would make them a unique people. Almost blasphemous, we might say, that they gave this leader the term high priest. They didn't want to give that leader king or queen because the Messiah was going to be the next king. We saw that in the days of the Maccabees. But by calling this person the high priest, there was some sort of veneer of religion around it that it simply did not have. So we carry that same spirit into the New Testament. When you see the Sanhedrin, when you see the high priest, don't think that they were above the jockeying for power. And now we see that with Jesus, right? But of course, they're always saying these things on religious grounds. It's for religious grounds. Jesus is, blasphemy. Paul is blasphemous when they say these things. Well, they don't care about blasphemy, right? They're political. It's a political entity. He's called the high priest. The Sanhedrin is technically a religious order, but it's all about politics. And don't lose sight of that when you're reading in the New Testament. So, yes, sir. Question. Well, so there would have been times. The Sanhedrin was somewhat weakened during the time between Hyrcanus and Alexandra. But any power that was had among that council was Sadduceic in that time. And then when she reestablishes the Pharisees, she gave the Pharisees positions of power. And so then they got a hold of these positions of power again, and the Sadducees were effectively deposed. And they were still there, they just didn't have majority anymore. So during this time, we meet this man named Antipas, or Antipater. And he was the leader of Idumea. Now remember, in the days of John Hyrcanus, which was only 50 years earlier, the Idumeans were forcibly circumcised and made to submit to Old Testament law. Antipas, he forms a league with Hyrcanus II to overthrow Aristobulus, and to do so primarily through deceit. This was probably a very wise move on the part of Antipater, in that if Hyrcanus is in charge because he's not a very strong leader, that would mean that Antipater would be able to influence him strongly, right? So he gets behind Hyrcanus here and is willing to be a part of helping him. Antipater also secures the help of Aretas, who's the Nabatean prince. We don't know a whole lot about the Nabatean people, except from various history books such as Josephus and whatnot. But they were the people, at least at this time in history, who populated, goodness, what's the name of it? I think it says it here somewhere. Petra, there we go, who populated Petra. And so Petra, of course, would be this city that was built out of parts of the city was built out of the mountains in what we call southern Canaan there. They were a people that would live in normal houses, but their temples and whatnot were carved out of the mountains. And so Petra would have been their capital, this Nabatean people. And Aretas would have been their prince, and he promises Hyrcanus II friendship under the condition that when he's restored to the throne, the Nabateans would get 12 cities back that Alexander Jannaeus had taken from them. So Aretas, he's successful. Hyrcanus is successful for a time, and he gets those cities. Everyone gets what they want, except for, of course, Aristobulus II. At the same time, we're coming into this time where Rome is beginning to assert its final power. And we'll talk a lot more about Rome in a few minutes. But the great Roman general, his name was Pompey, he begins his campaign throughout Asia. So we've already had the fighting with Hannibal, right? And they've taken Africa. And so they've got that western portion coming down through Egypt. And now they're going to start conquering through to get through Syria, Greece and Syria. And then, of course, conquering effectively the whole of the Middle East. So Pompey sends a man named Scaurus to Syria. He sends him there in 65 BC. And as he's there in Syria, and this is while they're still feeling out the waters, he hears about this war between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. He is interested in this. He's interested, of course, at this point, Rome did have a league with Israel, right? They had a mutual pact where they would help one another. And to that extent, Rome is going to put their fingers into that pie and try to discern who they would want to be leader. So Pompey is now going to see who he's going to put his forces behind in order to determine who he thinks would be best to be leader, what would be most advantageous for Rome. This is like any other nation today that might go into another nation and seek to help them depose a certain leader or keep a leader in power because it would be best for that nation's foreign policy, right? So both brothers seek the favor of Rome, and Rome sides with Aristobulus II. Hyrcanus, of course, was not doing well. Aretas was against him. Antipater was against him. Hyrcanus was there. But Rome sides with Aristobulus. And at that point, of course, Aretas is defeated. This final league with Rome there would prove to be, as we've said before, this reinvigoration of Rome's interest in the region would again be a major part of what would lead to the downfall of the sovereign Jewish state. In 63 BC, Pompey begins to move into Damascus, which at the time was controlled by the Nabateans. And he was met there by 3 Jewish representatives, one for Aristobulus, one for Hyrcanus, and one for the people. And the people sent their own because they wanted nothing to do with either of these guys. And so there's still jockeying for position going on. Pompey delays his decision on Israel fully. He had sided with Aristobulus against Aretas. He had defeated that. He's working now into the Nabatean land here. And he says, I'm going to finish with the Nabateans, which of course is technically helping Aristobulus, right? But he says, I'm going to finish with the Nabateans, and then I'll finalize what I'm going to do with Israel. Aristobulus, at this point, whom Pompey had initially sided with, Aristobulus begins to make Pompey a little bit nervous. And that's because Aristobulus was starting to fortify Judea. He was using the time that Pompey was going after the Nabateans to make his position stronger. Pompey doesn't like this, so then he marches against Aristobulus. Aristobulus submits, but at that same time, a band of resistance in Israel barricaded themselves in the temple, refusing to submit to Rome. This is where we begin to see the final transition into Roman power in the region. Pompey is not comfortable with Aristobulus, decides he wants to come against him, and in order to keep power, Aristobulus, who before had leagued with Pompey in order to run out the Nabateans, is now being forced out, and instead of being forced out, he makes a league, makes peace with Rome. Unfortunately, these 12,000 decided not to do that. They did not want to be a part of that. So the temple was besieged, it was overthrown, and everybody inside was killed. History records something like 12,000 Jews are killed in this massacre by the time the whole thing is over. And Rome is no longer going to allow Israel to be sovereign. The country was made tribute to Rome. The territory was then given to Hyrcanus. Because he was a weak leader, he would be a very easy leader to control. And thus we have the end of sovereign Jewish power. 80 years within this 450-year span, the Jews had sovereignty over themselves. And it was lost in this political jockeying for power. And in the course of events, 12,000 Jews have been killed. Rome is now asserting its dominance and its authority. And Rome is now in direct control. So that's in 63. 63 BC, Rome is now in direct control of Israel. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Rome at this time. So we've been focusing on Israel, and rightly so. Israel is our reason for doing this. That's what we're interested in. That's what we're focusing in on. But let's talk about Rome. So in 60 BC, Pompey, right? So all of this was happening in 69 to 63 BC. A couple of years later, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus, who are leaders in the military, form what they call a triumvirate. And the triumvirate was a consolidation of power against the Roman Senate. Rome, to this point, had been a republic. Very similar in some ways to the United States, which is today a republic. Republican form of government, which means that the people elect their leaders, and those leaders go to Rome, and they represent them. In a democracy, in a straight democracy, the people... Each person has a singular vote, and everything comes down to the will of the people. Straight democracies, such as there was a point in Greece where there was the idea of a democracy. Straight democracies they don't work. And they don't work because people are too easily drawn away into a mob mentality. They're too easily manipulated. So as soon as there's enough people that want something, the minority just keeps their mouth quiet, and then you have the rule of the mob, right? The 51% rule over everything, and then there may even be of that 51%, 30% that don't actually want it, but they think that everyone else wants it, so they go along with it. That's what happens in democracies. A republic, in a republican system, you have people who elect leaders, and then they entrust those leaders to learn all the information, to educate themselves, and they entrust them to make the decisions. And in doing so, the people don't have to know all of the ins and outs of everything that's happening in the empire. They elect people that they trust to represent them. And Rome was a republic. This triumvirate was a group of generals who basically took over they assumed a dictatorial position in the nation of Rome. This was not with the approval of the Senate. but they chose to effectively, because they had the military, they had the power, therefore they were going to do what they wanted. And so they became what was called a triumvirate, and it was basically kind of a three-headed leadership over Rome. The Senate still had power legally, and they still maintained some show of power, and yet they would not dare defy the triumvirate, or at least push them too far, because the triumvirate had the military. And the Roman military was formidable, to say the least. So he who has the military has the power, and this triumvirate takes over. Pompey begins to operate against the wishes of the Roman Senate, engaging in a campaign to reinstate King Ptolemy Auletes in Egypt in 55 BC. So the Senate is supposed to have power, but they've yielded all their power. They're writing letters saying, you're not allowed to do this, this is not legal, and Pompey doesn't care. In this time where they're reinstalling their own people in Egypt in 55 BC, a young man named Mark Antony distinguishes himself as a great military leader, and Mark Antony begins to rise through the ranks. Within this triumvirate, Marcus Crassus in 53 BC is assassinated. So now the triumvirate has fallen into just two men, but there will be a third man that takes over, and we'll see a rotating door of third men that take over for a little while. So you have Pompey, you have this man named Julius Caesar, and then at the time you had Marcus Crassus, and then several other generals would take over in Syria, fighting primarily the Parthians as that third general. Cassius Longinus from 53 to 51, then Calpurnius Bibulus from 51 to 50, then Vejento from 50 to 49. Notice they're all only living for 1 or 2 years here. In 49 BC, Pompey and Caesar, the third guy doesn't matter, right? He's coming, he's going. So Pompey and Caesar begin to vie over ultimate power. They are now the two top generals, and they're going to start fighting with their men. So at this point, the Roman army is loyal to their general. So you've got a portion loyal to Julius Caesar, you've got a portion loyal to Pompey, and then you've got this third general, a portion that was loyal to Crassus, and now is just has this rotating group of generals, and they're fighting over in Syria. Then you have Metellus Scipio as well from 49 to 48. So in 49 BC, Pompey and Caesar, Julius Caesar, they begin a civil war. And they are fighting over power, and they are fighting effectively to become head dictator. Now, throughout this whole time, the Senate is saying, you're not allowed to do this, you're not supposed to do this, and the Senate has given themselves some measure of illusion that these guys are on some sort of leash, but not really, right? The Senate is there. The people have this illusion of republicanism, but it doesn't really exist. These top leaders are the ones that are pulling all the strings, that are doing whatever they want. On September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey is assassinated by Julius Caesar, and he sets himself up as the supreme dictator of Rome. The final person that had the loyalty of any army has been destroyed. Caesar has now become the supreme dictator of Rome. Sextus Caesar is set over the province of Syria by Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is now the first Caesar, right? The supreme dictator of Rome. Sextus Caesar is set over Syria. Caecilius Bassus is set over, or assassinates Sextus Caesar, and he takes control of Syria. And that's in 46 BC. And then Julius Caesar is murdered on March 15th of 44 BC. Et tu, Brute, and all that, right? So Julius Caesar is now dead. This was the first attempt at a dictatorship. It really did not work. We talk about Julius Caesar. He's got the name Caesar. That's where the name Caesar comes from. But he really never became that thing. The Senate still technically has legal authority. There was assassinations and such going on throughout his entire attempt here. And then he's eventually assassinated. And from that arises a second triumvirate. Triumvirate worked before, so let's do another triumvirate. 43 BC, with a man named Octavian, a man named Marcus Lepidus, and then that man who had risen in that war underneath Pompey, Mark Antony. At this time, in 43 BC, the establishment of this second triumvirate, the Senate signs a law called the Lex Titia. The Lex Titia gave this triumvirate legal authority to exist. The Senate was still there, but the moment that they signed legal authority for this dictatorship, this three-man thing, the constitutional republic of Rome ended. This was the end. And they signed it over, right? They did not, this was not, Caesar was going to come in and, I don't know, dissolve the Senate. Who knows what he was going to do. But it didn't happen because the Senate actually signed over their own power to the triumvirate. It was only supposed to be temporary. The first one, they gave them a 5-year span because of the turmoil in the nation at the time. They gave them a 5-year span to try to help the nation. Remember, during this time, Spartacus and the slave revolt was happening, right? So in that time of the slave revolt, you've got the need for kind of a martial law type thing, right? Where the military takes over in order to keep some measure of power. So the Lex Titia, they sign over power to the military. These three men are going to share power for a time. It's going to be given back. At the end of the 5 years, they sign an extension. After that extension, it doesn't even come up again. And so the official ending, I guess official is probably the wrong word there. The day, November 27th, 43 BC, was the beginning of the end. It's the day that the Senate signed over their own power to dictators for political expediency, for security, whatever it might be, right? 44 to 40, questions or thoughts? Before we move on. Yeah, it goes quickly, doesn't it?
Well, this transition of power and the struggle that's going through the government is obvious. They're constantly killing one another off to, get on top of the pile.
Yep.
So in them signing over their power for that temporary, help,
Yep.
basically they gave it away into the Roman Republic, as it says right there. It just became a Caesar-type government.
Yeah, it would be kind of like when I was growing up in Colorado, and of course this is a silly illustration, but there's Denver now almost kind of has a perimeter highway, kind of like we have here in the cities. At the time, there was kind of a quarter perimeter highway called C-470. And when I was growing up, there was this big push to create another portion of this, another half portion that would make a 3/4 portion, and that was going to be called E-470 because it was on the east side of the main highway that went north and south through Denver, I-25. And I remember this big push was, we need the taxpayer dollars to build it, and so we're going to make it a toll road. And we're going to make it a toll road until the road is paid off. And that was the idea. We're going to pay off the road with the toll road, and then it won't be a toll road anymore. Because C-470 is not a toll road. E-470 was a toll road. So they said, we need to institute this toll. This toll is going to pay for the road, then it'll pay for itself, and then we're done. Well, here we are some 20 years later, and it's still a toll road. And it keeps going up, and the price keeps going up. Once you give the government money, that money never goes back, right? Once you give the government something, once you give power to someone, it's very hard to take that power back. Even if they say, I'm going to give it back up. Once they take it, there are very few times in history, George Washington being one of the exceptions, where they yield that power. They asked George Washington to become the King of America. The United States was ready to make him king, and he refused, right? Very rare thing in history to have a guy who has all that power placed in front of him and says no. See, because that's not how men work, right? Men are power hungry. When the Senate gave the triumvirate, the legal authority, it was never coming back. It was never coming back. It just doesn't happen, right?
It's for safety.
Right, safety, security. Yeah.
When they became slaves.
Yep. Yep, safety and security. You can imagine all of the arguments. This system isn't working. We need a strong man at the top who can guide these things. These men command the loyalty of the army. They will take over just long enough to get things stable again. They'll take over just long enough to give us safety and security, at which point then we can get things, it was Benjamin Franklin that said, when you yield liberty for security, you end up losing both. And it's happened everywhere that's ever happened, right? When you yield liberty for security, liberty is dangerous. When we talk about liberty in the Christian realm, and it's dangerous, right? The fact that we have liberty in Christ is dangerous because that liberty can mean that I take advantage of that liberty and I fall into apostasy or heresy or whatever it might be. And the solution that many people in various churches have come to is, okay, don't live in that liberty. Strip yourself of all liberty in order to guard yourself against the danger of losing, of taking advantage of that liberty. But then you become a slave, right? You have enslaved yourself to this religious system, and then you're a slave. You might be free from the danger of taking advantage of your liberty, but you have enslaved yourself to do it. And this is what nations have done time and time again, right? In the name of liberty, or in the name of security, in the name of trying to keep yourself from the dangers of liberty. Yes, it's more likely, because we have a Second Amendment, that someone is going to walk into some mall and shoot people. That's more likely. But if you take away the right for people to have guns because of it, significantly more likely that the government's going to start shooting people. Right? And at least if the guy's going into a mall and shooting people, he doesn't know who in that mall might also be able to shoot back. When the government has the guns, no one can shoot back. And so there is an inherent risk, there's an inherent danger that comes with liberty. That's why liberty is a responsibility. It's actually not a right. And yet, for all of that, the dangers inherent to liberty, number one, are significantly better than the dangers inherent than the dangers that come from not having liberty. And second, you also have liberty, right? Which is an end unto itself. And so they gave up a measure of liberty here. And there would still be the fingerprints of the Senate for generations to come. We think into Paul's day, right? Paul is getting beaten up by the Romans. And he says, are you allowed to do this to a Roman citizen? And the centurion goes, oh no, right? I'm in trouble now. Because he realized that he had just beaten a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens had rights. They did have rights still under Caesar. Of course, those rights were only limited to Caesar's will. And on top of that, it was a very hard system. So you think of the Philippian jailer. Philippian jailer, there's a jailbreak, an earthquake. He doesn't know what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. But because he thought that the people under his care were gone, he immediately knew, I'm going to die. So he was about to take his own life before Paul stopped him. That's the kind of hardness of the system that they had under the Caesars, that you fail, you die. He wasn't going to go before some sort of fair trial and be able to explain his case. He was going to die because the prisoners had escaped, right? And so you have these things. From 44 to 42 BC, Cassius Longinus and Mark Antony, who was one of the men that murdered Julius Caesar, they fight for power over Syria. Antony was victorious. This is why Cassius Longinus is pretty much unknown to history. Mark Antony then spends the winter of that year, 41 to 40, with a woman named Cleopatra. Now Cleopatra was not her name, right? It was her title, like Pharaoh. Cleopatra was a female leader in Egypt. So this particular Cleopatra was Cleopatra the Seventh Philopater, and that's how we know which Cleopatra it is. And this was the winter just before Antony and Octavian began to duke it out. So Octavian, of course, Longinus is gone. He's out of the picture. Now you only have, just like the other triumvirate, right? This idea of a three-headed leadership where these guys would share power and rule and lead the nation. It's not going to work, right? They're all in the position for one reason, because they all are good at getting power. You think they're going to stop at 3? They're not going to stop at 3. So Longinus is out of the picture. Now you've got Mark Antony and you've got Octavian. They end up with a treaty at one point where they partition power in the empire. Antony gets the west, Octavian gets the east, and that would be kind of the northeast and the southwest. And so Antony has power over Israel at this point. He has power over Egypt. Antony gives Cleopatra the authority over much of Syria and Palestine, which he has control over, and he appoints several vassal kings over his empire, over the part that is his. I think I might have those messed up. I think Antony was supposed to get the east and Octavian the west, because Octavian was actually in Rome and Antony was over here. So flip those. My apologies. So he has power over Syria, he has power over Israel, he has power over Egypt. Octavian's over here with Africa and with Rome and with Greece. One of the kings that Antony sets over the region, and this would be over the region of Judea, was an Idumean named Antipater. The son of that Idumean named Herod. So remember Antipater. Antipater was the guy that was working with Aristobulus, or Hyrcanus against Aristobulus. He was the Idumean king who was working with Hyrcanus and who was working with the Nabateans to try to take over and conquer Aristobulus, we were just talking about. His son is a man named Herod. And Herod is placed over Judea in 39 BC. And as we know from the New Testament, Herod was an Idumean, right? Antony becomes increasingly distracted by Cleopatra, remaining in Egypt, not really taking much care over his portion of the empire from 36 to 33 BC. Octavian sees this and he plays his hand. 30 BC, Antony and Octavian begin fighting again. Antony is overthrown at the Battle of Actium, and he flees to Egypt, his final stronghold where Cleopatra is. On August 1st of 30 BC, Octavian follows Antony to Alexandria, where Antony and Cleopatra take their own lives, hence that very well-known account of Antony and Cleopatra. And Octavian becomes the first truly supreme sovereign. Remember, it was in 43 BC that Rome passed the Lex Titia. 13 years later, Octavian doesn't care anymore. He has the armies, no Antony, no one to oppose him. He becomes the first sovereign ruler over the Roman Empire, and he called himself Caesar Augustus. He called himself this because he presented himself to the people as a dictator, and as we'll see in a moment, as literally the divine Son of God. That's what he called himself. And he presented himself as being the final will of Julius Caesar, that everything that Julius Caesar envisioned, he brought to bear. So he is the spiritual successor to Caesar. He is the Caesar. Thus Caesar became this title for the leaders. And of course he was Caesar Augustus, the August one is what that was the title. His real name was Octavian. So, his official title becomes Emperor Caesar Augustus, Son of God. And this is very, very important. This is in 30 BC. To understand the nature of Jesus' ministry to the Greeks, to the Gentile world. Okay, so to the Jews he comes as Messiah, right? But he presents himself as the Son of God. I want you to read with me in 9 BC, so this was probably only 4 years before Jesus is born. An Asian provincial assembly writes this of Augustus: the most divine Caesar we should consider equal to the beginning of all things. For when everything was falling and tending toward dissolution, he restored it once more and gave the whole world a new aura. So the idea of the empire was crumbling and he brought it together and held us together. Caesar, the common good fortune of all, the beginning of life and vitality. All the cities unanimously adopt the birthday of the divine Caesar as their new beginning of the year. Whereas Providence, which has regulated our whole existence, has brought our life to the climax of perfection in giving to us Augustus, whom it filled with strength for the welfare of men, and who, being sent to us and our descendants as Savior, has put an end to war and has set all things in order, and having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times in surpassing all the benefactors who preceded him, and whereas finally the birthday of the God has been for the whole world the beginning of good news concerning him. Did you hear all that messianic language? He is Savior. We are preaching the good news. That's literally the same word, gospel. He is the fulfillment of the gospel. He has come to bring us the gospel. He is the Savior. He has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier expectations. He has ended war and brought peace on earth and goodwill to men, right? That's what this wrote of Augustus. Now imagine that's in 9 BC. 4 years later, there's this rumor from Israel that these angels spoke to these shepherds and said, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Christ the Lord. He shall be called the Son of the Highest. He will be, remember what they called him here, God manifest, right? He will be called Emmanuel, God with us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So now we have this Jesus who's born, and we have him being written by Luke and by Mark and sent throughout the Roman Empire. He is the Son of God. He is God manifest. He is God with us. Imagine then why it was probably not too big of a leap for people in those cities to be able to say, these people are traitors to Caesar. That's Caesar's titles. And think also of Satan's role in this. What if Satan could bring about all of those titles for Messiah and say this, and by the way, there was also, it wasn't a virgin birth, but it was, in the history that Caesar built for himself, he was the product of his mother and Apollo. Half God, half man. He's a God-man. He is the product of a divine father and a human mother. He said that she conceived with a serpent, not with not virgin birth, but there was a conception there, but yet this divine idea. Yes.
Babylonian.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just carried down.
It's the mother-child cult, right? In a sense, but also very much so you can see the attempt by Satan, right, to undermine Christ. You also see this is the environment into which Jesus is stepping. This was 4 years before his birth. This was declared of Caesar Augustus.
So this letter was written in 31 AD?
This was written in 9 BC. And Jesus was probably born somewhere between 5 and 3 BC. We oftentimes think of Jesus being born on 0. Probably not. He was probably actually born a little before that. Yep, or compete with the prophecy as it would relate to that. And also perhaps God designing this in such a way as to be another clear distinction between man's attempt and God's attempt at a Savior, right? to show that distinction as clear as possible. And so that's what's happening in Rome at this time. And now Caesar Augustus is in absolute, he has abject power. So when Jesus is born, and there came this decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, Caesar had been in power officially since 30 AD, so for about 25 years at that point. Before that, you had a Roman Republic. So this dictator thing was still somewhat new to the empire. It was one generation in. Many people alive in Jesus' day would remember well before Caesar Augustus, right? They would remember the turmoil of Julius Caesar and of Pompey and Mark Antony and of the slave revolt with Spartacus and all of those things. But they're gonna, there's a lot of people that would have remembered that. They would have seen Caesar rise to power. They would have seen the empire changed and in a manner of speaking stabilized. And again, God was going to use it. Because under one of the nice things about a single top-down ruler is you cut through all the red tape. When you don't have a bunch of people fighting about what to do, right? When you don't have Republicans and Democrats that are constantly pulling back and forth, if everyone is under one banner, like when Congress and when the legislative and executive branch are all the same party, and you don't have that warring in government, things are streamlined, right? And when things get streamlined, in one sense, there's, of course, tyranny, but in the other sense, things get done. And so Caesar's now Caesar, and roads are getting built, and cities are getting built, and all of that money is being used that Rome has because there's no red tape. And so roads are being built like crazy, and that's going to benefit tremendously the gospel. Because what's going to happen? Jesus is going to preach. He's going to stay in Judea and Galilee. Then he's going to die. And then you're going to have the day of Pentecost. And on the day of Pentecost, thousands of people are going to get saved during that feast. And then they're going to scatter throughout the empire. They were all able to come very freely to that place because of the tremendous road system that Rome had built in those days of Augustus Caesar. And so now the ability to move throughout the empire has been tremendously helped by the infrastructure that's being built. And then once there's persecution in Judea, and then they flee, the Jews have to flee, they're fleeing all over the empire, and it's relatively easy to do so because of the infrastructure of the times. And so the Lord is in that too. And it becomes very clear as you study history just how deliberate this point in history is for Jesus, right? We talk about what's called the anthropic principle, that if you look at the entire universe, it almost seems as though the entire universe was built for this planet. Like everything is, like this planet was put right where it's supposed to be put, and everything around it is almost like it's positioned just for this planet. That's called the anthropic principle, and that's because God has done that, right? And God has done that because man is the focal point of God's plan here. It's almost as if all of history was put in place for Jesus. That there's this time and there was this place and there was who was in charge in Rome and what they presented him as and the infrastructure that Rome was able to build to get around in the empire and where Israel was and all of their suffering and all of the death and all of their persecution and everything that they'd gone through. Remember now, we're only about 60 years into the Roman domination of Israel. There might still be people alive. Anna the prophetess, most certainly. Anna the prophetess would have remembered when Israel was sovereign in the days of Alexandra. She probably would have been a young woman, maybe a child at the time, but she was alive. She was alive to see, because she'd been a widow for 80 years, right? And by 0 AD, Israel had only been under Rome's thumb for 60 years. So she saw that. She understood. There were still people alive that were able to tell others about when they were sovereign, when they were their own country before Rome came in. And so there's this messianic expectation, and there's this nationalistic expectation. And imagine Jesus. Jesus steps into this world, and he's the Son of God instead of Caesar. And he's God manifest instead of Caesar. So already Rome is a little bit not happy about this, right? And then he goes to this Jewish people, and he tells them that righteousness with God has nothing to do with whether or not they keep the external trappings, right? Keeping the Sabbath day, being circumcised. These are good things, but they can't live up to the expectations of the law, and that's not God's demand. That they must believe. Okay, so the Maccabees die in 160. The overthrow is in 163, 164. So for 150 years, by the time Jesus is there, 200 years, there's been this history of dying for those very things, right? Imagine that your great-great-grandfather saw his family killed because they were circumcised. And imagine that your great-grandfather saw his family killed because they refused to stop keeping the Sabbath in the days of the Syrian Empire. Imagine the kind of passion that would instill for those values. My family, my grandparents, my posterity died for this. Kind of like we would think in America, right? We think of those who fought in World War II, and they died for these freedoms. And how that works up within you, this fervor that says, I'm going to hold fast to this because my posterity, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they died to secure this for me. And then Jesus comes plucking corn on the Sabbath. Now, at the time of the Maccabees, they were fighting to keep in place these distinctives as a representation of their love for God. But these distinctives have since become their God, right? But they don't see that. What they see is, here's the man that's supposed to be Messiah. The man that the Maccabees said, we're not going to put a king in place. We're going to only put high priests in place waiting for Messiah. And this guy comes Messiah, and he's doing the very things that my great-great-grandfathers died for, died to maintain. How conflicting would that have been in their hearts? Now, again, I'm not saying that means that they had every right to kill Jesus. No. But you can understand why Jesus becomes such a stumbling stone to the Jews, right? Because what once had been a right, fervent desire got completely goofed up over these 200 years and was elevated above God himself. But in the mind of those Pharisees, maybe they're thinking, you'd have us go back to the days of Hyrcanus, when we Pharisees were hiding in caves. When Hyrcanus was making leagues with Syria. You'd have us stay under the Roman thumb. That's not our Messiah. And when you understand all this history, you can at least understand why it was when Jesus comes saying, the kingdom of heaven is not, I've not come to be your physical king. I've come to be your spiritual king. And they'd say, the last 200 years have all been about us dying for our king. Us suffering, not refusing to yield the distinctives of the king that would come, that we've erected in our minds, and it has become mythological to them. It's become significantly more than obviously what the Word of God said. But that's going to happen, isn't it? Aren't you going to elevate things above their proper place when your grandfathers died for it? It happens in our culture too, right? that we have these myths that transcend these leaders. We talked about George Washington. There's no historical evidence that he actually chopped down a cherry tree and said, "I cannot tell a lie," and whatnot. But we've elevated him to this picture, right? He is an avatar of freedom. Many have done that with Abraham Lincoln, have done that with World War II, have done that with the statue of Iwo Jima, right? And the taking of Iwo Jima. And it's not to say that any of those things are bad, but what we do understand is that history has a way of, when we see men who have suffered and died for what we hold dear and for what we appreciate today, you can see it become elevated perhaps above what it was. And that's happened to the Jews. And we should not be surprised of this, but once again, it settles why Jesus came when he did. Because Jesus had to die. And Jesus came at the time when the Jews would simply not accept him. There was not going to be a scenario within that time in history, if we can say it that way, where the Jews would wholesale accept him. And that was by design. It doesn't mean that they couldn't have accepted him. They could have. They had will. But with that 200 years of history standing behind them, wasn't going to happen. Which means he was going to be crucified. And he had to be crucified, didn't he? He had to die. Because if he had not died, then we would all be dead, spiritually speaking. So God is the master weaver of history, weaving it all together. Next time, we'll pick up here, and we don't have much time left. We've only got 50 years. We will be able to finish this off, talk about a few other people, and should be done.
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.